because we're working on these companies from inception, our economics in some ways are similar to the founder economics. And so more so than maybe like the traditional VC economics. And so there's a much wider range of exits that would be excellent for us.
Thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the US Department of Defense each year. But so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the valley of death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now. I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley. All right, so if you're a Crossing the Valley listener, you know that there are very few people who have taken capabilities from concept to production in the defense market. There are even fewer who have done it twice. Now, today's guest is setting out to do this multiple times a year. My guest today is Kyle Olson, a Marine Raider and COO of Fairwater Labs, a defense venture studio that is productizing the defense innovation process. Kyle and I are going to discuss the Fairwater model, the value proposition of working with a venture studio, and how success in defense doesn't necessarily have to mean billion-dollar exits. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, excited today to have with us Kyle Olson, the COO of Fairwater Labs, which is probably one of the most unique companies we've had on the program so far. Fairwater, we're going to learn more about it, but incubating and building a whole generation of defense tech companies. So Kyle, thanks for making the time, man.
Thanks, Noah. Looking forward to it.
Let's start with the entity that is Fairwater. Tell us a little bit about what it is, what you guys do.
Yeah, so Fairwater Labs was spun out of a major VC firm in the Bay Area with really the thesis that they had a couple companies that were doing work in the defense space. They really liked it. They saw that there were a number of barriers to entry, and they said, one, how can we get more of this defense tech stuff? This was before the kind of current wave of technology. But then two, can we put together a base of institutional knowledge to help people get around some of these barriers to entry and maybe even valleys of death or desolation? So that's what the genesis of Fairwater Labs was. And so we really do three things, I'd call it. One, we develop conviction around market opportunities related to the defense technology space. And so primarily looking at need statements from the DoD and other related organizations, kind of looking out in the technology landscape more broadly, what is possible, what's feasible today technologically that wasn't a couple of years ago. And then once we kind of have conviction around an opportunity and the timing, we then go ahead and start moving to the second phase, which is building a team and a proof of concept. And so typically we're putting together a team. We're looking for people with a lot of end user empathy, if not necessarily experience themselves, although usually we like people that have some sort of experience or connection to defense technology space. We pair that person, typically a business lead, with a technology, tech talent.
Yeah.
And then we put them towards, hey, we have this concept that we put together. We think it's a great idea. Let's go ahead and see if we can start working on it and prove it in the wild. So we put together a proof of concept. And at that point, if we've got green light on both sides, we then go ahead and fund that company, and then get it out into the wild. And so we've started this process in 2021. We've launched 4. We'll be launching our third this year, so our 5th.
Wow.
And next year, our goal is to launch 4. So
4 in a year.
4 in a year.
So big growth times.
Big growth times for us. Yeah. Well, and what I always tell people is, I think over the past 6 months or so, we've established a product market fit. Basically, we've identified, hey, these are the things that we need to do on our end to set these companies up for success. This is how we build them, the system and the process in place. And then we're lining up the capital to get them out onto the wild in a sustainable way. And so we've really got that system nailed down in 2024. So 2025 is going to be production.
It's exciting. I mean, and there's really not many. I mean, there's venture firms have done individual incubations. There are some other venture studios, but really not many. Like you guys are one of a handful, 2 or 3, maybe tops. So excited to get into that process and hear more about what you're learning and what's allowing you to scale. But before we go too far, I want to bring you into this, Kyle, which is you've got a really interesting background, and this is a very unique role. So tell us about kind of who you are and how you found yourself at the helm of this organization at this time.
Sure. So I'll start kind of back in the beginning. So my dad was in the military. Both my grandfathers, great grandfathers. So you can guess that I was growing up, that was probably one of the top things I was thinking about. Remember the September 11th pretty well. Lived in the DC area at the time. Actually, for my mom's Christmas present that I made at school that year. Like, you make like a little ornament at school, and on it said, when I grow up, I want to be special operations in the military. Wow. And so now that I'm a parent myself, that was probably a bit of a dagger in my mom's heart if I had to imagine, but it was 2001. And I think that was kind of the spirit of
that's cool.
The time. And so went to college, was always planning on joining the Marine Corps. So did ROTC, went straight to the Marine Corps after that, infantry officer, which was a great experience. And then wanted a little bit more of that. So tried out, joined the special operations, Marine Special Operations, and Marine Raiders. So as a team commander there for a couple of years. And then my kind of culminating event there was deployment to Iraq in 2020. And so February, March timeframe, we were actually kind of hot and heavy with ISIS, kind of pursuing them in places throughout, kind of remote places throughout Iraq. And specific incident that like probably was the turning point or catalyst for me to move from the military, which had been my goal, obviously, to the private sector was we were in a firefight late February 2020 with ISIS, and we knew where they were at. We'd gone hunting them basically. We got pretty close to where they were at. Bottom line, we got into a firefight with them. Some of my guys were pinned down. Some of our Iraqi partners were injured. We had airstrikes. We had aircraft in the overhead. We were doing airstrikes. And so my job as the team commander was communicating back the higher headquarters. He was using kind of military technology that many people are familiar with, big green radios. If anyone's been in the military, they've felt them on their back or messed with them. Anyway, what in the course of my job was doing all that. At some point in the chaos of the firefight, we're moving around, doing very danger close airstrikes. The antenna of my radio broke, SATCOM antenna, encrypted radio. And so I'm trying to do all these crazy workarounds to talk back to my headquarters, relaying through vehicles, trying to coordinate with other, getting the aircraft to try to relay for us. And what I ended up doing was reaching in my pocket, pulling out my Iraqi cell phone that all of us were kind of not supposed to have, but had anyway. And I ended up texting them on Signal, the talk, and they had Signal too. And so I got the help that I needed that day. And so we got this guy's medevac, we got the airstrikes all taken care of. We're driving home from that mission at the end of a very long day. I was just like, why is this the way that it is? Why are we using these things when we have better commercial technology out there? So you'd say that was a bit of an epiphany for me in 2020. And so as I was coming back from that deployment late in the summer, I started thinking like, what can I do personally to affect a change on this space? And so was on my way to business school, and through a bunch of happy circumstances, met the Fairwater Labs team. And they were like, hey, do you want to not go to business school and maybe come work here instead? And I was like, I'll come for a year and then I'll go to business school. And I've been here for 3 years. So
smart call, man. Smart call. If you don't have to delay life with the MBA, go do the life thing. That's awesome. No, it's an amazing story. And it actually fits with a theme that I think a lot of the companies and a lot of the founders that we talk to is just this, we're kind of at this moment where commercial technology has outpaced kind of the exquisite government-directed R&D in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases. I think trying to figure out how we integrate that civil military fusion part of how do we take the things that are being developed at often private expense in our economy and make sure that our military and that the men and women doing the mission benefit from those technologies, key thing. And so what I love about, or we're going to talk about today about Fairwater, is it's not just a product, it's not just a company. In some sense, the process is the product for you guys. Is, hey, we've got a way to actually supercharge the way that concepts become capabilities for the military. So talk to us about the Fairwater process and how you guys operate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that I kind of laid it out in broad brushstrokes, but I think one of the things that we're always looking at is where's the market now, where is it going, and how are we going to get there? And so as we're looking at where we're at now, what's the current need statements? Where's the technology going? What are we seeing kind of reading the tea leaves? Like I've been at this for a couple of years. The whole time I was in the military, we were pivoting to the Pacific. And so eventually we're going to get there, I guess. But bottom line is that's been top of mind: contested logistics, manufacturing resurgence in the United States, reshoring or nearshoring, big data plays, now artificial intelligence. These are all trends that they come out and we kind of all start realizing them. It sort of starts off as a flash in the pan in some ways, but you realize in 2 years, this is not going to be just a novelty. This is going to be expected.
You got to get it done.
Yeah. And we were talking about this earlier, but everyone's an AI company now, which kind of sounds like a cliche, but if you're not using it, at least in some ways, it doesn't really make a ton of sense, why you're not for most things. And so bottom line, so developing conviction around where the market's at, where it's going, where there's need statements now, where do we think those need statements are going to be in a couple of years.
Yeah, so let's start with that one and dig in a little bit deeper. And by the way, my favorite AI-ism is like AI, the government uses AI like a condiment. You just kind of sprinkle AI on things that everyone's having. But so when you talk about developing conviction and evaluating need statements, leaders give speeches, there's the budgets, there's, requirements packages, which are very often classified and we don't necessarily have access. How do you all think about parsing this massive amount of information to decide what's a company we're going to explore?
Yeah. So one of the things that we're looking at is the critical technology areas that the DoD's put out. And there's a couple different lists out there. And some of them we've kind of said like, hey, we're not going to spend the CapEx to be like a hypersonics company. So like we can kind of write a few. In quantum, we can kind of write some of that stuff off. That's okay. But there's some really big areas that are huge and they're not going to be solved in a couple of years or by releasing a couple of different SBIRs or production contracts. These are like generational things. Like how do you connect data? How do you connect different types of hardware to each other, integration layers?
Yeah.
And how do you harness the data that's being used? How do you process it? Now, people are saying like we can't 10x the number of people we have analyzing data. So how do we analyze data 10 or 100 times better? Like these are the things that we're looking at. And so we look at those critical technology areas. And then we also look at kind of based on our recent experience, based on people that we talk to that are in the seats, where are things going? So we try to keep our ear to the ground pretty closely with the overt need statements and then where things are going to be going.
So you have kind of like a human intelligence network of your own in some sense. And that's taken a few years to build up and is a function, of your own personal relationships as well as those of the institution? Or
Absolutely. Yeah. And, a lot of us have maintained ties to the reserves and other organizations. And so we keep a close eye on what things are doing. And of course, we're looking at what the market's doing as well, but we focus primarily on the customer because one of the things that we've seen, and not to give away our secret sauce too much, but like we can look at opportunities that might be passed up by people that are kind of on the hardcore venture train, because we can look at maybe markets that are a little bit smaller, still very sizable, but maybe not a $10 billion market where we can find an opportunity because of the way our economics work. We can work on that.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about that because that is interesting, and I think we talk about a lot of the folks we have on here are people who have taken non-venture paths. Because I think one of the messages of this podcast is there's a lot of ways to win in the defense market. Venture is not only not for everyone; it's often the wrong answer for certain technologies or certain founders. So how do you all think about setting an objective for a company at inception?
That's a great question. So I think one of the things that we don't shy away from necessarily is trying to win or be super excellent at a very small niche thing. I mean, very small, probably relative, like in the tens or hundreds of millions opportunity. And like
potatoes,
But bottom line is like we're saying, hey, if we can delight and exceed expectations in this one specific area, either A, we can bring a technology and a company to light and then give them a home inside of a larger company. That's one path. Or we can say, hey, we became excellent at this one thing. Let's become excellent at another adjacent thing, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that for us, because we're working on these companies from inception, our economics in some ways are similar to the founder economics. And so more so than maybe like the traditional VC economics. And so there's a much wider range of exits that would be excellent for us than maybe some other people that were
totally. Okay, so I took us off course. So we talked about phase one, which is kind of looking at doing the sensing piece of seeing what's out there and where you might build. When you decide, hey, okay, IoT connectivity is like the area we want to build in, what's the next step?
Yeah, so the next step then is refining that concept maybe a little bit further in-house. But what we really say is like, I mean, I'm not wearing the uniform every day anymore. And so who do I need to talk to that can tell me, that can validate like that these ideas that we put together, these concepts that we put together are actually valid. And so then we move into a heavy phase of customer discovery and customer interviews. And so we can do dozens, hundreds, depending on the specific opportunity that we're looking at. And around that point, once we're kind of pretty sure we have that conviction, we're like, who can we bring in to the team, kind of working under the Fairwater umbrella to start with, that has a lot of end user knowledge and empathy, has a passion for this space, maybe some personal history in it, and then can really drive that discovery train using their own knowledge. And because like we say we're not the customer. We think we're very highly of ourselves, but we're not the customer, we're not the buyer. And so we need to figure all that stuff out too. And so what we end up doing then, that's when we start looking at a team. Who can build this? Who's built something like this before or worked in this space? Maybe not necessarily at the founder level, but at excellent organizations where they picked up some skills and are hungry for entrepreneurship. Or conversely, we mostly look at people with some form of government or military experience. And that's kind of where I'm talking about, like the end user empathy, where they experience this problem themselves and maybe they'd like to try a crack at solving it.
Yeah.
And so once we kind of have those teams together, then we're saying, okay, we had a broad concept. It's a little bit messy. Maybe we refined it through these dozens of interviews and your own personal experience and like what you're passionate about building if you're one of our founders. And then we say, okay, build a proof of concept around it. And we fund some of the development for that. Once we get that to a place where we're impressed by it and some of our customers are impressed by it, we're like, okay, let's launch this out and bring it into the world.
Very cool.
So that's the end of phase 2.
Yeah, no, that, and just to, I guess, one or two follow-ups there on the people piece, because this is everything, right? Like you're hiring a founder. It's not an employee. You have a concept. You've got a little bit of traction, but not really. I mean, you are finding founders, which is, you talk to any venture investor, it's like, especially at the early stage, founder team is the thing. So when you think about the pipelines that have really borne fruit for you all, where are the pockets that you guys mine? You talk about people who have empathy, but how do you find those people?
So I think most everything that we find is like a function of like fit and timing. Mm-hmm. And I kind of use those heuristics when I'm talking to everyone that is prospective, people joining our firm. But there's a fit aspect because you're right. Not everyone's an entrepreneur. The other thing is not everyone is kind of like the archetypical like ramen in the garage like founder either. We typically are targeting people that have some actual experience in the space they're working in. Maybe they're in their late 20s or their 30s. Maybe they've got some financial obligations and they can't necessarily, don't want to or can't at the moment like bootstrap or take nothing. And so what we're kind of, especially people that are coming from the military, because they just have a different financial profile. I mean, I was in those shoes, so I get it.
Sure.
So the thing that we're trying to do is say like fit wise, we're not necessarily looking for someone that totally wants to do it themselves.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of, if you want to do that, you should just go do it.
Yeah.
Like you don't want to work with us. You want to
end up presenting kind of.
Yeah, they'll end up presenting the process. At the same token, we don't want someone who's just a manager or like an executor who's like, hey, we're going to give you the mission orders and you're going to follow them. And we want someone probably geared more towards the entrepreneur, but is willing to say like, hey, I'd like to work in a bigger structure where I can have help, I can have support. I can help people. Some people can help me with go-to-market, they can help me with product, all that sort of stuff. So fit. And then timing, there's obviously career instances and all this sort of stuff. We've had great instances of finding people that are kind of in seams between things. So recent MBA graduates, people that are leaving consulting firms, things of those nature. And then on the tech side, a lot of people that maybe have had an exit at kind of a junior level and they're kind of, maybe they've taken some time off or want to kind of get back in the ring, but they want to do it kind of more on their own terms. So we've had some great luck with that. And of course, like people have been leaving big tech for various reasons, but one of them is like there's a disconnect between their contributions and the impact that they'd like to have in the world. And that sort of hunger is exactly what we're looking for. So pockets of talent everywhere, but those are the two like timing things that we really.
It's awesome. And you and I have talked about this before. I think like there's no one type of founder, and having something like a Fairwater available just makes entrepreneurship available to more types of really, really solid people.
Right.
You can build really, really good companies, but need different styles of support. So, we're not here to say one is better than the other. It's a portfolio of opportunities.
Right.
So that's great. We're at the point now in the story where, okay, you've got a team, you've got a concept, you've got an MVP, you've got conviction in this market. You're ready to launch into the world. What does that look like?
Yeah. So for us, we bring this whole package all together to our investment committee. They approve it, launch it, then they approve it. Typically, we've set that process up so we're not bringing someone up to fail. But basically, once they get to that stage, we fund them with a little bit of capital. But the idea is like, now let's see how you run on your own for 6 to 9 months.
Okay.
We've started to identify some SBIRs or other OTAs or other contract opportunities, basically. But let's see how you run in 6 to 9 months. And we'll check back in on the investment side at that time. while all that's going on, so we bring it to committee, it gets approved, we fund it, launch it, incorporate it, all that sort of stuff. Then we kind of move to, our role changes a little bit. We kind of move into more of like an advisory and support relationship. And so throughout this whole process, we have a go-to-market function, but it really starts to kick in once the company's incorporated and on its own. And so all of our companies are founded, set up legally in such a way that they can pursue small business contracts and other sorts of opportunities that are out there. So majority controlled by the founders. And so then we say, hey, we have this go-to-market arm though. And so the go-to-market arm starts to really kick in at that point. And we're like, okay, we've got some in-house support for that. So let's put some tools to this so that we can get it out faster. And so that's one of our first like barriers to entry that we're trying to get to is like first revenue from the government, customer introductions, get invited to specific test and evaluation events where you can get your technology in front of the customer. These are the type of things that we can really do once these companies are incorporated.
So you're pretty hands-on, even after kind of spin, so to speak.
Yeah, we're pretty hands-on. I'd say, these things tend to taper off at a certain time, but like once we start to incorporate, it's not the end of the road for us. We're maintaining consistent support throughout at least the first year or two, and then maybe even further beyond. Of course, those relationships change, and of course, like as you bring in enough capital through dilutive or non-dilutive means, you say like, well, hey, I'd like to have my own go-to-market function. Okay, we don't, you don't necessarily need to use this. As you bring in more investors, maybe our role as an advisor sort of changes a little bit. So that's all natural and these things.
Part of growing, it's kind of the crawl, walk, run of the process.
Yep.
I don't want to gloss over something because you said something really interesting, which if folks are familiar with the venture studio model, it's one of the big controversies. You actually said the companies are majority owned by the founder.
Yep.
Is it a standard deal for the founders or is it a little bit
It's not
different?
necessarily a standard deal. What I would say is we don't call ourselves this but it kind of makes sense if you think about us as almost like a third co-founder or a fourth co-founder in the case of multiple, a 3-person team.
Yeah.
But if you kind of think about us like that, we feel like, especially at the beginning, our contribution does really equal that. Like we're bringing a lot of the IP to the table. We're funding a lot of the development ourselves. We're providing that go-to-market function. And so, but at the end of the day, we want these companies to be able to stand on their own. We want them to be able to fit, at least broadly speaking, within the venture ecosystem if that's what they choose to pursue for their next round of funding. And so, yeah, they're majority owned by the founders.
It's cool. It's very cool that's the structure y'all have chose. Let's talk about an example because I think part of what will bring this to life is tracing one of these companies from inception to an exit or a successful outcome, not just financially, but for a mission.
Yeah.
So is there a company that for you guys that's kind of gone from soup to nuts?
We've had one company that's gone from soup to nuts. I'm not sure if I can necessarily say it publicly, but basically what happened was launched in 2021, moved pretty quickly into getting some early R&D contracts, OTA money over the next 12 to 18 months.
What kind of market was it in?
In the biometric space. And so they were building a product. They did build a product that basically revolutionized biometrics. And if anyone's done biometrics in the military, they knew that process was pretty bad. So they were able to bring that into the present and into the future in some ways. And so over 12 to 18 months, developed it further, put together really solid products, and ended up basically getting into the position where they're competing for contracts that are quite large in comparison to how long they've been around. And so what the founding team realized was this company could be could do better work for their end users and for the contract opportunities that they were coming across if they were part of a larger company. And so at around the 2 to 2.5 year mark, this company actually sold itself, was acquired by a larger player in the space. And pretty successful outcome. And now they've pretty close to being awarded $20 to $30 million contract, within 3 years of inception. And so pretty successful outcome for the founders, a great outcome for the founders, great outcome for Fairwater, and kind of a proof of concept of in a 3 to 4 year period, we can go from idea generation, team development, product development, even into a production contract and an exit in about 36, 48 months.
It's an impressive timeline, especially in this market. And as you said, an exit at a smaller scale is probably something that's not on the table for a company that's taken a ton of venture money at that.
Well, yeah. And exactly. And that's one of the things that it was a very successful outcome for us in terms of IRR or, whatever metrics that you use to tracking your portfolio. But right, it wouldn't have necessarily made sense from another perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, that's one of the ways that when I was talking earlier about us kind of sharing a lot of we could kind of calling ourselves a co-founder in some ways, our economics also in many ways match that of the founders. And so, this is a pretty successful outcome for them. could be a great outcome for us too. So
yeah. Have your companies raised additional venture money outside of Fairwater's initial kind of seed capital?
yes, they have.
So how do other venture investors look at you guys on the cap table? Because that's one of the things that we hear a lot about venture studios is it's confusing. But investors like pattern matching.
Right.
Have you come across that?
Well, yeah, we have come across that. And I think it has been, it's a mixed bag and some people don't like it and some people think it. I do think that the market, and we're not the only ones doing this in the world, of course. And there's quite a couple of successful ones, venture studios out there.
It's a growing market.
Yeah, Pioneer Square Labs. And so these things are becoming a little bit more popular. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that there's kind of a realization that kind of what we were talking about earlier is like there's fit, right? There's some people that maybe aren't the archetypical, social network founder sort of thing. Like they're looking for something a little bit different. Maybe it's a little bit more capital intensive. Maybe the sales cycle is longer and it would be harder to sustain that on your own. And so I think those are some of the things. But yeah, we've had some pushback on some of that, but we've also had other companies that are like, hey, I'm totally comfortable with this because these people are, we're not only, they didn't just like drop you a couple of years ago, like you're still actively working on them and doing that. So I think that's something that's helped with us. And I do think that the recognition in the market's like, hey, this is a very viable path. We have kind of sources of capital that are traditionally working with us. Our companies have raised capital from other people too.
The other side of this coin was, I'm curious about this exit decision for you guys. And is it fair? Did you guys have a not a controlling interest, but board seat on this other company? So how did you guys think about this decision of, do we accelerate, raise more money and go at it this way? Or do we go at it with a partner company? What was that discussion like?
I wasn't necessarily the lead on that conversation, but what I can say is that the government likes larger companies. We've talked about this even this weekend here at the Boone Summit. They like to work with larger companies that have some sort of track record. And so I think one of the things that you can say to like de-risk, if you're a startup, you're staring at a large contract that's multitudes above whatever you've done before. There can be some reluctance on the part of the program manager or PEO to commit to that, something like that, because you've never done it before. Yeah. And so I think in the case of this specific contract, I'm not necessarily sure that it would have materialized if they hadn't been able to be part of a larger organization. So I do think that there's financial returns and things that are super important on that front. There's also like, where does this capability best live? Sure. Is this going to be a $1 billion company? I mean, in this case, maybe it could have been, but like, I think more realistically, it belonged in a portfolio of technologies that could really bring it to life.
It's a success story, and it's a different path than a lot of the stuff that gets the big news coverage. But right. I think it's great. So Fairwater's obviously, you guys are growing this year. There's a belief that it can be bigger. How much bigger? Like, what do we think maximum capacity is for something like that?
That's a good question. So I do think that, one of the things that we are constantly track is how much of our time, effort, money, expense is tied directly towards launching the portfolio companies, and how much is it tied to kind of our own management fees, I guess you could say, or like management expenses at G&A. And so I think that what we're going to find out next year, and we have a thesis around this, I think we're going to spend about 70 to 80% of our cash flow on just basically reinvesting into these new companies. And so if that's going to be the case, which I think it is, I think we're going to say like, maybe it could get double what it is, like what I'm saying now, 6 to 8 companies a year, maybe. But I also think our goal is to make sure that these are super high quality outputs. And so part of the recruitment path for us is, okay, I've got my experiences, you heard about them. Can I bring in other people that have had different experiences that may have some knowledge on different areas of the defense industry that need disruption or that need new technologies? So for example, we're bringing on our first aviator in the next couple of months. And so like, that's a totally different perspective that we didn't have before. We don't have anyone that's touched space before. Yeah. And so maybe there's a space play as well. We've got a Navy officer. So maybe like there's some more stuff that we can do there. So I think for us, we're going to be looking at those critical technology areas I talked about. Where's the spend on new technologies in the government? And do we have all those areas sufficiently covered to make a difference? And if we get to a point where like, hey, we're over covered, then we need to look back, but we're nowhere near that right now.
How do you think about the left and right bound? Is it strictly defense and national security? Is it just government? Is it broader?
Good question. So we, for the most part, are what I'd say defense first, but dual use like always, I guess if you could say. So most of our companies are founded with sort of a defense focus. In the case of the first company I was talking about, biometrics, not a huge civilian application, but there were some. From that company onward, we've really been looking at where is there at least a defensible commercial play that we can make. We just launched a company in the open source intelligent risk management and narrative intelligence space. And so this Clara Copilot, and one of their big focuses is going to be, how do you as a company manage perceptions about you and the environment? Just you care about that just as much as the United States or the military cares about its perceptions across the world too. And so how do we tailor a product that fits with something like that? We're launching a new company, Delta Learning, that's going to be focused on using artificial intelligence to help people train and learn using conversational AI for high impact, low density conversations, super important places where they need to get their message across. They have to do it right the first time. How do you train for that? Well, AI is maybe a perfect way to train for something like that. But even from just me talking about it, people's minds go all sorts of different places.
Yeah.
Military is one, education, healthcare, all sorts of other places. And so we do keep an eye closely on dual use, but usually our imagination starts with where's the warfighter use for this? And then we kind of go from there.
So it's using that as a kind of a crucible of company creation. But if one of these companies spun up a commercial sales function and went beyond to some other industry, you guys wouldn't veto that.
No, absolutely. And there's very logical reasons why you might want to do so. And everyone in the defense industry talks about the valley of death, and it's a real thing. But let's say that's at the 2 or 3 year mark. Well, maybe it takes 2 or 3 years for you to hone your commercial sales cycle. So while you're waiting to get through the valley of death, you're building your commercial business at the same time. And so, especially with some of the technologies working on now, if you can pretty easily plug and play into the commercial space, why wouldn't you? And so we're very supportive of that.
It's cool, man. I would love to reflect and just kind of pull back as we've gone now deep and specific on some of these companies. You've been doing this for a couple of years now. You've started numerous companies, which is, for a couple of years to see whatever it is, 4 or 5 companies come out is a crazy, high volume for a founder type of person. I'm curious, what you've seen as what have you learned from all of this? What do you think most of the companies in this space maybe get wrong?
That's a good question. So I won't start with what's wrong, but I will say one of the things I have learned is that there are a ton of good ideas out there. There's a ton of great ideas out there, and execution is super important. And so I think that as a founder, one of the things we're always honing in on is what's the story? What's the communication pathway that you're going to go for to make people understand, break through the noise? One of the things that often some of the companies that we've founded here is I've heard that pitch before. And well, maybe you have, but have you seen execution like this?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we look for is we're going to be different enough maybe for something that's out there, but how can we relentlessly drive execution? Because the ideas, we have a backlog of ideas of in the hundreds, and so we have hundreds of ideas that are in a backlog, and maybe we're waiting for technology, maybe we're waiting for founders, maybe it's just not even a good idea. Many of them are probably not good ideas, but all that to say, the ideas are easy. Finding the people to execute them well is hard. So I think
back to people again.
Yeah, it comes back to people. So that's the most important thing that we're doing. And so I think that's probably my biggest lessons learned is the ideas are one thing, but where do you find the people that are passionate and willing to step in the arena, to use the quote from TR, to start moving on these things.
Yeah. So execution, and that's a hard thing to screen for. Have you guys found any good heuristics when you think about? Is there a quick test? Is there a Google pothole question for Fairwater?
That's a good question. So I think one of the things that we found to be helpful is are you willing to accept an ambiguous assignment with unclear directions? And people that have been through some of the military selections will have seen this. Take your instructions from the whiteboard. We're not giving you any further instructions. We're going to give you. A lot of times our relationship starts off with a pretty low stakes, low promises, and uncertain expectations about what it is you're going to do with your time if you start working with us. And we see how people perform with that. We see how people perform with hey, this legal contract's a bit ambiguous. Are we going to renegotiate it? Or hey, if that's your mentality, this probably isn't going to be for you. And so I think that we do have some of those little tests that we put in place that they're not intended to, it's not good or bad. It's not any sort of judgment. It's fit, like I said earlier, is this going to be a good fit for you or not? So I think we do look closely at that. And then we we do really look at like people's hunger to make a difference in the space that they're talking about here. And so it's pretty easy to suss out that sort of drive. And we've of course had people that join for various reasons, left before founding a company or you know, and all that sort of stuff. And it's a normal part of our pipeline, and that's okay. We get it. And that comes back to timing a lot of times too. It's like, hey, you know, I've got a family thing or I need to take a career change, and that's okay. So those are,
getting people out of it before they start a company, if they're not the right fit, is a success, not a failure.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
No, that's cool. I'm reminded by your the ambiguity test of, you know, early days of Palantir, as it's been relayed to me. These companies this company didn't even really have job titles. They threw people in, and if you hired the right kind of person, they would kind of walk around and talk to people and figure out a way to be helpful. And it's just sets a screen for such entrepreneurial talent, hungry talent, and people who are self-starters. I think there's something really powerful about those who can make sense out of ambiguity. So cool to see you guys do that. This is a really kind of important part of the defense tech ecosystem. If folks are intrigued, if they are thinking about, man, that sounds like a pretty darn good way to start a company, how do they get on your radar?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I would say this, like, you know, we're talking about screening, like, people that directly reach out, you always go to the top of the pile. We had a founder recently who I was like a month away from posting a job description, and he just happened to reach out at right time, right place, right action. And he's the founder of one of our companies today. And so I think reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me an email, Kyle@fairwaterlabs.com. I chat with a lot of people because we want to get this right. We love chatting with people that are passionate about this space.
Awesome, man. Well, excited about what you're doing. Excited to continue to watch you guys as you create more and more companies and hopefully have a lot more successes, and appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's been great, and love to get to know you too, and love to see the passion that you're bringing to this industry. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.